Hello, and welcome to the Ultimate Strategy Podcast, your go-to podcast for everything strategy. Each week, we'll share a new episode covering a wide range of topics designed to help your business grow smarter by making strategy both approachable and actionable. I'm Laura Blackmore, Head of Strategy Execution at Cascade.
And I'm Devina Patel, Strategy Execution Director. Hello, everybody, and welcome. We're super excited to have you with us today and stay tuned for our weekly episode drop. Now, before we dive in, let me thank today's sponsor, Cascade. Now, Cascade is the #1 strategy execution platform, and Cascade really does help turn visions into reality by working as the strategic brain of your organization. Thousands of incredible organizations use Cascade to plan, execute, and track their strategies, all in one place, improving the efficiency and speeding up decision-making across the organization. By successfully executing their strategies, Cascade customers are making a real difference, from deploying life-saving vaccines to engineering the fastest Formula One car. If you want to get your team moving towards your vision in one central platform, please check out Cascade at www.cascade.com. We'll leave all the links in the episode show notes. I've been looking forward to this topic so much. So Laura, let's get into it.
Today's topic is a classic, but it's a very powerful one. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. That quote, famously attributed to Peter Drucker, reminds us that no matter how brilliant your strategy is, it won't actually succeed if your culture doesn't support it.
Exactly. And I think culture is this unforeseen kind of force sometimes, or unseen force. It's the dark horse, Laura, and it actually shapes how things get done in reality, right? You could have the most incredible strategy plan, most incredible and impeccable looking document, but actually if you don't have the right culture to support that, nothing actually goes anywhere. So today we're going to unpack why culture is so critical and how it can even derail the best of strategies. And what we want for you to take away today is really how to align your culture with your strategy for success.
Yeah, exactly. And I think let's start breaking down the quotes. I think everybody's heard this quote, or everybody in business at least. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. But what does it mean to you, Devina?
So I think for me, what I really take from this phrase is that actually culture is more of the shared values. It's the beliefs, it's the behaviors of your organization, right? It's the intrinsic nature of what you're doing. And I think that has a greater impact on execution than the strategy itself, right? I think if your culture isn't aligned with your organizational goals, it doesn't even matter how brilliant your plan is.
Absolutely. And I think of it this way: strategy is the blueprint, but culture is the team that actually builds the house, actually builds the foundations and actually gets it executed and gets it to completion. And if those people aren't motivated, if they're not aligned, if they're not empowered, then that house isn't going to get built. It's going to be a disaster.
That's a great analogy. So I know we love analogies here at Cascade. But I think it's also worth mentioning that doesn't mean that the strategy itself isn't important, right? It just means that the strategy won't succeed on its own. Culture and strategy are like a dance. That's my analogy that I'm bringing in here. It's not about one leading the other. It's actually about both of them working in harmony in a beautiful dance together, I think.
I love that. And let's talk about what happens when culture and strategy clash. I think, I've seen this before in organizations. And one example that really stands out is when a company tries to implement a customer first strategy, but it actually doesn't have an internal culture, reward mechanism that strives to actually bring customer satisfaction. For example, cost cutting, or having a really, really lean team that isn't actually able to execute that customer first strategy. And then employees end up in the middle. They want to deliver great service, but the culture actually discourages it.
Yeah, that's a great example. I think that probably a lot of our listeners can relate to. I've also seen it happen in parallel with innovation and MPD strategies. Leaders often say that they want to foster that creativity, right? That innovation, that true spark. But culture punishes failure. And actually, a big part of innovation is failing fast, right? And accepting that and not actually seeing it as failure. So how can employees take risks if they're afraid of the consequences, if they're afraid of speaking up about their crazy idea. So I think we need to be really mindful of how we see that kind of clash manifest in an organization.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that creates what we call that strategy culture gap. People might intellectually understand the strategy, but the day-to-day behaviors that the cultures reinforces is actually working against it. And a quick red flag for anyone listening that is thinking, yeah, this kind of, I'm resonating here, but I don't know, how to identify it maybe. I think if your strategy feels like a new initiative or constantly feels like you've got these, ping, new idea, new thing, new shiny thing, rather than part of your organization's DNA, it's likely clashing with the culture. So bear that in mind and just take a deep dive on whether this is something that you can embed into the organization's DNA. Obviously not overnight, and it takes a little bit of time to do that, but stop getting out of this sort of new initiative, new idea. Make sure it's really harmonized with the culture and the values that you actually set out to achieve in your business.
That's a really great point. I feel like we need a mini red flag to wave when we highlight things like this. And I think it's actually ultimately why leaders can't just roll out a strategy. It's not a project, right? They actively need to shape the culture to support what they're trying to do. So I think maybe that's where we lean into next. How do we build a culture that truly supports strategy? And I think maybe we start with the basics. What would you say, Laura, are kind of the key components of culture?
I think definitely talked about one of them, which is sort of the value element. But I think there's three main parts, and they're quite similar, or quite bucketed in the same realm, if you like. And I think the first one is the values, the second one is behaviors, and the third one is symbols. So values are what an organization believes in. Behaviors are how people act based on those values. And symbols are the visible signs, like awards, policies, or even the office design that reinforces those values. It's interesting actually thinking about the office design. I've worked at some really innovative but very customer first focused organizations. It's kind of my thing. I like customer obsessed organizations, let's call it that. But I once worked at a company where the office design really supported that culture. And I'll give you a really great example. We had a airline customer, and they were one of our flagship. They were one of the first customers we had. And one of our offices, I think, was called like the Emirates Lounge or something like that. And the whole office was designed as if you were sat inside a plane. And I remember thinking, wow, that's like really innovative. But I think what it really reinforced is that while we were in meetings making decisions about how we maybe worked with a customer or how we did something as an organization, we were actually sat in the shoes of our customer. And there were other ones, there was one that was like a construction site. There was another one that was like you were sat in a retail store. And it reminded you that when you are making big decisions in an organization, you have to act as if you are in the shoes of the customer. And that really, I remember that is probably one of the most customer obsessed companies I've ever worked for. And it just felt like our values were reinforced when we were making those decisions. And so that always just stuck with me. I don't really remember policies, kind of remember the awards. They were very like customer centric, but the office design always stuck with me because it was so innovative, but also an easy thing to shift the culture.
I love that. And also I think if you want your team to think boldly, think creatively, well, we can't stick them in a clinical office and cubicles and expect them to behave in that way, right? That just exactly. It's like chalk and cheese. It doesn't work. I love that. I wonder what some of the world's most creative offices are like. Imagine Google to be up there. But I love that. And I think when it comes to aligning culture and strategy, those components that you mentioned, so values, behaviors, and symbols, well, they need to directly connect with the goals, right? The objectives. And if your strategy does focus on innovation, then your culture should reward experimentation, not just outcomes. It should encourage these bold and brilliant ideas rather than punish them.
Absolutely. And I think, speaking of Google, one of my favorite examples is actually from them, and they have values like focus on the user and you can be serious without a suit. Again, it's similar to the organizations I was talking about in the past. Yes, you got to kind of look good, but you can also do that in a t-shirt or a jumper. You don't have to be suited and booted. And particularly depending on the kind of organization that you work on and the kind of clients that you work with, making sure that those values actually suit the kind of organizations that you're working with. And they're not just words, but they translate into the behaviors. So, one of the behaviors that I think a lot of organizations can learn from is encouraging open feedback in order to grow and take that criticism, but in a really positive way. And also, things like flexible work, not, I think we've all read the articles about the 9 to 5 and the working from an office versus home and what's right for your business, etc. You've got to find the right balance for your business, and you've got to find the right mechanisms. And of course, if you are in a call center and you need to support customers during the day, then flexible work might not work for you. And that, that's just the way that it is. It's exactly the same in a healthcare setting. You can't be too flexible because you've got to be in person. But there are other organizations where you can bring greater flexibility, you can bring greater encouragement of feedback, and you just have to find the right culture that supports your organization, but one that also helps you deliver on your strategy as well. And it's not easy, but I think, harmonizing all of those is super, super important.
The dance, Laura, harmonizing the dance. Yes, exactly. And I think symbols play a huge role too, right? I know Google's open office spaces and their time policy for allocating 20% of employees' time to personal projects. So that's like taking a Friday to actually work on personal development and increasing your skill set. I think that's an incredible thing. And those symbols reinforce their culture of innovation. They understand that innovation takes time, space, not having back-to-back meetings, right? Not having your notifications constantly on. And I think that wider acceptance of that is incredible. And, you can imagine some of the amazing ideas that come out of potentially those Fridays that employees take.
Exactly. Yeah, that's so true. And it's, it's interesting. I think about some of the organizations that I've worked from, and I personally need that creative space. It's where most of my great ideas come from, but also my great work comes from. So I think back to settings where actually I had, 12 hours of back-to-back meetings and I constantly had to be on green on Slack and I had to be available. And that wasn't conducive to my creativity. And I also did not thrive in that environment. And I look at the environment that I'm in now, which is like the polar opposite, and the work that I'm able to do and the creativity that I'm able to bring. And of course, that doesn't work for everybody. So, sometimes it does shake the culture a little bit in the employees that you might have. But that culture isn't just a mission statement. It isn't just about the things that you have written on the wall. It's the lived experience of your employees and the things that they thrive, the environments that they thrive in when they come to work to hopefully do their best work.
So well said. And I think maybe now let's tackle that big question, right? How do you actually align culture with strategy? Laura, what's your take?
So I think for me, first of all, leaders need to walk the talk. If you are pushing a strategy of collaboration, but the leadership team is very siloed, then it's going to send a mixed message. And if you are pushing an innovative strategy, but you're not allowing innovation, then you're not going to get that innovation. So I think, you've got to get that. You've got to get the leadership on board, first of all. You have to get them living and breathing this strategy and culture dance. Let's use that analogy again. They have to know the choreography. They have to know how to do that dance and how to do it well. So I think that's where I would start.
That's a great point. And I guess maybe another important step in the alignment piece is measuring your culture. How do you track success, right? Just like you would track metrics for your strategy execution, you can use different tools like engagement surveys, pulse checks, culture audits, which external companies can help with, I think is an incredible thing, again, to get a third-party perspective to really understand where your culture stands.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. I've worked with a few organizations that have actually paused their employee surveys because they know that they're going through a bad time. And I'm like, I personally find that a bit crazy because, you've got to be honest with yourself. And yes, it is a bad time, but imagine all of that information that you'll gather from your employees rather than just relying on intuition. And so that kind of leads me on to, you've got to identify the gaps. You've got to start making intentional changes. For example, if your culture doesn't value innovation, then introduce recognition programs that reward creative ideas. Even if they fail, you've got to start doing the right things. You've got to identify the gaps, and then you have to start putting those changes into reality because they take time. They take a lot longer than is imagined.
Yes, I love that. one of my old jobs actually ran a kind of Shark Tank-esque kind of project or initiative for employees, which I thought was incredible because it just meant that everyone could come up with these bold, brilliant ideas around customer success. And then some of them actually got taken forward into formal, kind of initiatives and ways of working. But I love the fact that they had also almost gamified it. So then it kind of encourages that creativity, that healthy competition as well. But one thing I don't think we should forget about here, Laura, is onboarding, right? That initial period when a new employee joins your organization, new hires are like sponges. They absorb culture quickly. And what we also know is that culture is contagious. It can transfer easily from one person to another. And that also means in a negative way. So you want to make sure that you use the onboarding phase to instill the behaviors that really align with your strategy.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good tip. I think let's not underestimate the power of storytelling, sharing success stories that highlight how the culture is supporting the strategy. I'm thinking back to a recent example where we had some bold, ambitious goals last year, but there were people who were coming together and, really making them happen and being collaborative. And it was like almost this organic culture that was happening. And I think one of the greatest things that we did was actually share it and keep sharing it and keep talking about it. And I think just making it super tangible and relatable for people to recognize. That's the hardest bit. I've worked in organizations where you can see that some people aren't really aligned with the culture. And as much as you can reinforce and, make it really tangible for them on how they relate to it and how they become part of the culture, sometimes they're just not a good fit. But I think sometimes they just haven't had that experience or they're quite new in their career and they don't know what it's like to bring the good culture. So you've got to make that relatable and tangible for people. It's no good just saying to somebody, you need to be more customer focused. You need to be more customer focused. You got to show them, hey, this person over here has displayed this, this behavior and they did this and they did that and that made them more focused on the customer. I think that's also something really important and something that I've seen work really successfully in other organizations.
Yeah, I love that. And maybe what we could kind of taper off with is a few practical takeaways for our listeners. So, Laura, what's your number one tip for aligning culture and strategy?
I think similar to what I just said, but let's make it, a bit more tangible for the listeners. Start small. Pick one behavior that's going to support your strategy. So let's say cross-functional collaboration. Make that a really key focus and reward it. Talk about it. Watch how it spreads. I think that's probably the easiest thing that you can do. And again, it can take a couple of months to really instill. But the more that you reward it, the more that you talk about those behaviors and the more that you see it organic. That's the most critical and important thing of this whole podcast episode is like, you can't really force it. You have to let it play its course organically. If you force it, and I've been at an organization that really forced this particular culture, which just I was completely misaligned with, but that forcing of it was almost awkward and we almost, the employees almost didn't like it. And that's what I found really interesting because you can't force it. It's got to happen organically, but you can nurture it. What about you?
Yeah, I love that. That's natural. So I think a big kind of reminder to all of our listeners and leaders is that you must listen to your employees. They are the ones living the culture every day. And they often have the best ideas how to bridge this gap, right? And if, as an example, if your employees are asking for flexible working in order to deliver their best selves, listen, right? Because otherwise you're going to have frustrated employees who ultimately probably will leave. So I think listening to your employees is super important. Taking the feedback on board. As you said, that pulse survey, the sentiment check, do it. Even if the answers might not be what you're looking for, it's important to get that honesty, but also make sure you value that and respect that with changes, right? Don't just take it in one ear, out the other. Truly listen to your employees.
Yeah, I like that. That's such a great point. And I think one last thing I've kind of touched on it a few times, but be patient. Like culture doesn't change. Culture change doesn't happen overnight, but with consistent effort and not too many pivots, it's definitely achievable.
Absolutely. Great. So to wrap this episode up, what we would definitely say for you to take away is that a great strategy can only succeed if it's supported by the right culture. So don't treat culture as the afterthought. Actually, it's your biggest asset in execution. And I know Peter Drucker would be very happy with that wrap up, Laura. So thank you, everybody.
And we'd love to hear from you. How does your organization approach culture and strategy? Share your stories and questions with us in the comments. And if you've got an incredible story to tell, or if you just got a story to tell about culture and strategy and how they've come together in harmony, we would absolutely love to have you on the podcast as well.
And make sure to tune in next week. We'll be talking about another exciting episode. It will be filled with a bunch of practical tips, just like this one, that you don't want to miss.
And in the meantime, don't forget to subscribe to the Ultimate Strategy Podcast on your favorite platform so you never miss an episode. Also, check out the link to our website that we mentioned in the episode description. And a big thank you to our sponsor, Cascade, for making this podcast possible.
Thanks for listening. And remember that great strategies are only as good as their execution.
So take action, make it happen, and see the results. See you in the next episode for your weekly dose of strategy.